Hello, my name is Sean Latham. I'm the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English at the University of Tulsa and the Director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. I want to welcome you to what we're calling our Corona Coffee House. Over the next several weeks, we'll be celebrating National Poetry Month with a series of readings brought to you by members of the English and Creative Writing faculty at the University of Tulsa, by our graduating seniors, and by members of the larger Tulsa community. We'll begin first with a series of relatively short readings with commentary brought to you by a number of members of the English department at the University of Tulsa. We believe that in these trying, difficult, and confusing times, poetry in particular offers us the opportunity to create fundamental human connections, not just between individuals, but connections with other minds and other places that might stretch across decades and centuries, that will remind us that we're not alone in our fear, our anxiety, not alone in our hope. I plan to kick this series off with a reading from a poem by William Butler Yeats called Easter 1916, that he wrote really just in the immediate aftermath of the Easter 1916 rebellion in Ireland. If you don't know anything about the history of Ireland, this was a moment when a small group of revolutionaries seized control of the center of Dublin. At the time, Ireland itself was still a colony of Great Britain, and these revolutionaries believed that they could seize power and liberate their country. Now, they did so, of course, in the middle of World War I. And at that time, the British had no patience for this, and they sailed a gunboat up the River Liffey, which would be a bit like sailing a cruiser up the Hudson River, and they began to shell the center of Dublin, destroying buildings, killing people, and eventually many of the leaders of this plot were executed, some summarily on the spot. Yeats was bewildered by this event. He was himself a proponent of a certain kind of Irish independence, but really didn't know what to make of this sudden burst of violence. He was in many ways like us now. He realized that he'd been living in times that seemed sort of normal or day-to-day or familiar, and suddenly history happened, right? There was a shock of a certain kind of event that he couldn't make sense of. And this poem is his first attempt, perhaps, to make sense of that shocking event. I'm going to skip one stanza just so we keep this relatively short, but I want to read to you from William Butler Yeats, Easter 1916. I have met them at the close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is born. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter, seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part, our part to murmur name upon name. As a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. Was it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that's said and done. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed, and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in verse. McDonough and McBride and Connolly and Peirce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Now I offer this poem in part because I think it can speak to our present moment. Indeed, I think that's one of the great powers of poetry, is not that it's just confined to its present day, but that it can speak to us in the very moment in which we're living, and that we can see these sudden sparks that arc, in this case, across more than a century. Yeats, in this poem, looks across the city, right, a city that has just suffered this violent rebellion. He thinks of the men and women that participated in it, and he thinks to himself, I made jokes with them. I just met them, leaving the pub at the end of the day. They were just everyday people. And now, because they participated in this event, as he says, their names are changed. Everything about them is different. He sees the day-to-day life about him in a different way. He feels the movement of time, that middle stanza where he talks about the horse hoof slipping into the river and the stream running by is all about time passing by urgently. Right, and feeling yourself suddenly caught up in it. I can't help but feel this way and think this way about the many people now who we see as fundamentally transformed because we are locked into this historical moment with them. I'm thinking of nurses, of doctors, of grocery store clerks who are stocking shelves, the postal delivery people from Amazon or the US Postal Service who come to the door, and of people who are doing essential work that we'd barely seen or we might have just said hi to and thought nothing of, and now we understand as being essential to our day-to-day lives. At this moment, they too are changed utterly. Their beauty too, especially, right, the postal delivery person that might hand you a package, the nurse that might greet you at a doctor's office or in a hospital, they too are changed utterly when we see them. They too are bearers of a terrible beauty. A terrible knowledge that we are living in a kind of world historical moment, that everything around us is changing. Yeats, in this poem, famously, when he thinks about the death of these men, he begins to cast about for a metaphor, and he thinks about them falling asleep, like a nursemaid lulling, or a mother lulling their children to sleep, he says, on limbs that had grown wild, and then says no. He rejects the metaphor of sleep, and he says they died. He sees them for what they are in that moment, and he rejects all the artifice of poetry. Right? He rejects any kind of symbol or metaphor. He tries to speak as plainly and directly, as powerfully as he can. That's the terror of the moment. That's the terrible beauty he too is trying to create in this poem. It's the terrible beauty we now see all around us, in other people passing us by, and people we meet in our day-to-day lives as we remain quarantined and isolated in our homes. And I think that's finally what Yeats can offer us in Easter 1916. It's the naked fact of the history in which we live and of the sheer difficulty that we face in simply trying to make sense of it. My colleagues will also be helping make sense of this moment with a whole series of readings that will follow this one. I hope you'll join us, and I want to thank you again for tuning in to our Corona Coffee House. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lars Engel from the University of Tulsa English Department, and this is my poem for the day. There are many poems which offer themselves as what one wishes one said in certain recurrent situations in life, but what one never quite has the presence of mind to say in quite so perfect a way. And this is a poem that is enacting, but also providing a script for a breakup, but a breakup that, like lots of breakups, is in a sense attempt to reconstitute a relationship on more tenable terms. It's by Michael Drayton. It's from a sonnet sequence from the 1590s. Drayton, like many, wrote sonnet sequences after the publication of Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella in 1591, I think, which created a kind of vogue for sonnet sequences among late Elizabethan poets. This is Idea 61. Since there's no help, come, let us kiss and part. Nay, I have done, you get no more of me, and I am glad. Yea, glad with all my heart that thus so cleanly I myself can free. Shake hands forever, cancel all our vows, and when we meet at any time again, be it not seen in either of our brows that we one jot of former love retain. Now, at the last gasp of love's latest breath, when, his pulse failing, passion speechless lies, when faith is kneeling by his bed of death, and innocence is closing up his eyes. Now, if thou wouldst, when all have given him over, from death to life thou mightst him yet recover. He's saying, okay, let's make a clean break. Let's handle things so that neither of us has any regrets, so that we can look each other in the eyes without expression in future. But if you were to change your mind about a few things, this might not quite be over. Thank you.
Hi, this is Sarah Beam. I am an applied assistant professor of English at the University of Tulsa, pausing in the middle of my day to share a work of poetry with you all for National Poetry Month. I wanted to share a work by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, a 19th century British Victorian writer, because she's one of my favorites. And I decided to share a little bit of a work called Aurora Leigh with you. So a little bit of context before we jump in. This work was published in 1857 and is rife with details reflecting the construction and deconstruction of feminine gender during the Victorian era. The 11,000 line autobiographical free verse novel poem was designed to, quote, rush into drawing rooms and the like where angels fear to tread, end quote, as described by the author herself, Barrett Browning. Browning, like her protagonist, feels the best place to find subject matter for poetry is in contemporary times, in contemporary settings, and her goal is to portray her age without masking the humanity of her characters. In this work, she's concerned with subjects of fallen women, illegitimate children, women's education, women authors, and communities of women. Aurora Leigh, an orphan, narrates the work and is a stand-in for Browning. Aurora voices Browning's concerns in the story of her life, and the moment we're going to step into in the poem is the moment she turns down a marriage proposal from her cousin, named Romney, because she values her independence in her own life as an author more than a stable marriage and companionship. So I'll share a few select lines with you, starting now. Again, this is a bit from Book 2 of Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Then I spoke. I have not long stood on the strand of life, and these salt waters have had scarcely time to creep so high as to wet my hair, to wet my feet. I cannot judge these tides. I shall perhaps A woman's always younger than a man, at equal years, because she is disallowed maturing by the outdoor sun and air, and kept in long clothes past the age to walk. Ah, well, I know you men judge otherwise. You think a woman ripens as a peach, in the cheeks chiefly. Pass it to me now. I'm young in age, and younger still, I think, as a woman. But a child may say amen to a bishop's prayer and see the way it goes, and I, incapable to loose the knot of social questions, can approve, applaud august compassion, Christian thoughts that shoot beyond the vulgar white of personal aims, accept my reverence. And a bit further down she proceeds. Now, I said, may God be witness twixt us two, and with the word meseemed I floated into a sudden light above his stature. Am I proved too weak to stand alone, yet strong enough to bear such leaners on my shoulder? Poor to think, yet rich enough to sympathize with thought? Incompetent to sing, as blackbirds can, yet competent to love, like him? I paused. Perhaps I darkened, as the lighthouse will that turns upon the sea. It's always so. Anything does for a while. A bit further down she says, what you love is not a woman, Romney, but a cause. You want a helpmate, not a mistress, sir. A wife to help your ends. In her no end. Your cause is noble, your ends excellent, but I, being most unworthy of these and that, do otherwise conceive of love. Farewell. Farewell, Aurora, you reject me thus? He said. Why, sir, you are married long ago. You have a wife already whom you love, your social theory. Bless you both, I say. For my part, I am scarcely meek enough to be the handmaid of a lawful spouse. Do I look a Hagar, think you? So I'll pause there and highlight for you that what's going on here is she's saying that Romney wants a helpmeet, right? This sort of traditional idea of a wife as a servant. And she's not interested in that in this point in her life, though she does marry Romney later, an ending that echoes the conservative ending of Jane Eyre, if you're familiar with that story. So, thank you very much for pausing with me and listening, and have a good day.
Hi everyone, my name is Simon Hahn. I am teaching creative writing at TU, and I hope you're doing okay. I'm going to read a poem by Stephen Crane, who is better known for his prose, Red Badge of Courage, for example, but I love his poetry. His poetry, to me, they're like little fables, very intense, and often not very uplifting. And so you might be wondering why I chose to read one of his poems, and actually I'm kind of wondering that myself. But I'm going to attempt to make the case that this particular poem is quite peaceful, and that it can be a kind of balm for these times that we're going through. So we'll see if that lands, but we'll give it a shot. It's a short poem. It's from a collection of poetry called The Black Riders and Other Lines. And interestingly, Stephen Crane didn't call his poems. He called them lines or pills. And in this book, the poems are all very short, and they're untitled, just have Roman numerals. So I'm going to read the third poem in this collection, and for the sake of the video, we'll call it by its first line, In the Desert. Okay. In the desert, I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who, squatting upon the ground, held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, "Is it good, friend?" "It is bitter." "Bitter," he answered, "but I like it, because it is bitter, and because it is my heart. And that's it. So first of all, sorry. I know that it's kind of disturbing. I probably should have warned you a little bit first. I did tell you that it wasn't overtly uplifting, but there's so much going on in such a small space. I love the way the image unfolds. With every line, with every additional clause, we gain a more vivid picture, right? It's not just a creature, it's a naked creature. It's not just a naked creature, it's a naked creature holding his heart in his hands. It's not just a naked creature holding his heart in his hands, he's eating it too. And the way Crane takes his time in such a short space makes that image all the more startling. But I think even more surprising is the second half of the poem. How the creature answers the speaker's question. Is it good, friend? Well, it's bitter. But again, there's the unfolding, the turn of expectation. It is bitter, but I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart. By the second time we arrive at the word heart at the end of the poem, it's a different heart from the first one we encounter at the beginning of the poem. I mean, at the beginning of the poem, the creature itself is very much like an it, a monstrous being, dehumanized. If anything, the creature is spectacle, right? This gruesome image. But what do we do with it? What do we know about it except that it's gruesome? Not much. But in a span of a few lines of dialogue, the creature is given a voice and given a life, a whole life that we can fill in our imaginations as readers. I know that I start thinking about the hardship and suffering that he must have endured to come to this sort of mindset. But also how the kind of way he's accepted himself and embraced his heart through the act of eating it. And I know that's kind of twisted, but I think about what we're going through, our collective experience, and how on the other side of it, we might come away with greater clarity and empathy and see one another's hearts in that way. We might even see our own hearts with greater clarity and empathy. And, you know, that doesn't mean we have to eat our hearts, but it could be as simple as listening to its beating and marveling in those small miracles. So yeah, that's what I got for you. Thank you for listening, and stay safe out there and be well.
Hello everyone, I'm Mark Rideout, Applied Assistant Professor of English at the University of Tulsa. In honor of National Poetry Month, I'd like to share with you a couple of passages from Shakespeare that I think speak well not only to each other, but also to our human need to connect and comfort, a need I think many of us are feeling acutely at the moment. Since Sir Patrick Stewart is so ably covering the sonnets, all of them online right now, I'll be reading from one of Shakespeare's late plays, The Tempest. This first passage is spoken by a character who is not at this point in the play known for his ability to connect or for his compassion. Caliban, he's the only natural inhabitant of the island on which the other characters have been shipwrecked and marooned. He is on his way with two of the shipwrecked sailors across the island to actually murder his master Prospero and take over rule of the island with these two men. They are being pursued by Prospero's invisible spirit assistant Ariel, who is doing everything he can to dissuade them. and they're hearing invisible music being played, voices that they don't know where they're coming from, and the two men obviously are becoming agitated and frightened. Caliban, however, is accustomed to this kind of harassment and knows where it's coming from, but he sees that these two men are becoming increasingly fearful, and he turns to them and says suddenly, "Art thou afeard? Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then, in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again." This is a surprising passage for this character who suddenly takes note of the way that other people are feeling, and this lyrical compassion blooms in him suddenly, and he does what he can to comfort them. It doesn't last very long. Obviously, they soon take off on their mission again, but I think it's a beautiful moment that shows a different side of this character than we've seen, and indicates that maybe he is not the bad character or the villain that he's been portrayed. Shortly afterwards, in another part of the island, Prospero himself is in the midst of conjuring a magical pageant for his daughter Miranda and the prince to whom she has just become betrothed. It's a complicated, large, lavish affair, and Prospero has gone to great trouble to create it, when he suddenly remembers that Caliban and the other two conspirators are on their way to murder him. And he calls the pageant to a sudden halt, and it all comes crashing down and disappears suddenly. This is startling to Miranda and to Ferdinand, her beloved, and in another strange moment of perception, Prospero turns and sees that they're at least puzzled, maybe agitated, and he says to Ferdinand, "You do look, my son, in a moved sort, as if you were dismayed. Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Sir, I am vexed. Bear with my weakness. My old brain is troubled. If you be pleased, retire into my cell and there repose. A turn or two I'll walk to still my beating mind." So these two brief instances when characters who have not been shown to be particularly thoughtful of others' feelings suddenly display this compassion and reach out and make an effort to comfort other people in a moment of trouble. I just thought that would be an appropriate way to commemorate this month in the midst of this pandemic, when we're all looking for ways to comfort each other, and hope that it will help anyone who hears this to think about the comfort that we can find in poetry, in literature, and in the arts, and maybe to share it with each other in the best ways we can. Thanks for listening. Stay well. In the words of my hero, Mary Chapin Carpenter, stay mighty, and thank you again for listening.
Hello, my name is Don James McLaughlin. I'm an assistant professor of 19th century and early American literature at the University of Tulsa, and very happy to be participating in this poetry reading today. I've chosen a selection from Walt Whitman's 1865 volume, Drum Taps, which he composed during the Civil War while serving as a volunteer hospital visitor in the hospitals in Washington, many of which were makeshift or built out of pre-existing structures in order to serve the many soldiers who were brought to Washington after having been wounded in battle. Later, Whitman would say to one of his literary executors, Horace Traubel, that these poems were, quote, put together by fits and starts on the field, in the hospitals, as I worked with the soldier boys, unquote. I've chosen a poem from Drum Taps titled The Dresser. An old man bending, I come among new faces, years looking backward, resuming in answer to children, come, tell us, old man, as from young men and maidens that love me. Years hence of these scenes, of these furious passions, these chances, of unsurpassed heroes, was one side so brave? The other side was equally brave. Now be witness again, paint the mightiest armies of earth, of those armies so rapid, so wondrous. What saw you to tell us? What stays with you, latest and deepest, of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements, of sieges tremendous? What deepest remains? O maidens and young men I love, and that love me, what you ask of my days, those the strangest and sudden your talking recalls. Soldier alert, I arrive, after a long march, covered with sweat and dust. In the nick of time, I come, plunge in the fight, loudly shout in the rush of successful charge. Enter the captured words. Yet lo, like a swift running river they fade, pass and are gone, they fade. I dwell not on soldiers' perils or soldiers' joys, both I remember well, many the hardships, few the joys, yet I was content. But in silence, in dreams' projections, while the world of gain and appearance and mirth goes on, so soon what is over forgotten, and waves wash the imprints off the sand. In nature's reverie sad, with hinged knees returning, I enter the doors, while for you up there, whoever you are, follow me without noise and be of strong heart. Bearing the bandages, water, and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle, brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground, or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital, to the long rows of cots, up and down, each side I return. To each and all, one after another I draw near, not one do I miss. An attendant follows, holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go, I stop, with hinged knees and steady hand to dress wounds. I am firm with each, the pangs are sharp, yet unavoidable. One turns to me his appealing eyes, poor boy, I never knew you. Yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you, if that would save you. On I go. Open doors of time, open hospital doors, the crushed head I dress, poor crazed hand, tear not the bandage away. The neck of the cavalryman, with a bullet through and through I examine, hard the breathing rattles, quite glazed already the eye, yet life struggles hard. Come, sweet death, be persuaded, O beautiful death, in mercy come quickly. From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, remove the slough, wash off the matter and blood. Back on his pillow, the soldier bends with curved neck and side falling head. His eyes are closed, his face is pale. He dares not look on the bloody stump and has not yet looked on it. I dress a wound in the side, deep, deep, but a day or two more. For see, the frame all wasted and sinking, and the yellow-blue countenance sea. I dress the perforated shoulder, the foot with the bullet wound, cleanse the one with a gnawing and putrid gangrene, so sickening, so offensive, while the attendant stands beside me, holding the tray and pail. I am faithful, I do not give out. The fractured thigh, the knee, the wound in the abdomen, these and more I dress with impassive hand. Yet deep in my breast, a fire, a burning flame. Thus in silence, in dreams' projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and the wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips.